Grant Halden stood rigidly beside the reinforced observation pen at Halden Prime Genetics in northern Nevada, his breath fogging in the cold air as he watched the massive white bull inside move, with a mixture of fury and frightening calculation. Torvik, a 3,500-pound Brunhurst bullbred from one of the most prestigious bloodlines in the region, threw his weight against the steel gate once, twice, 3 times, each impact ringing through the facility like the clang of a warhammer. The gate, rated to withstand anything short of a charging bison, bent inward as if it were nothing but thin aluminum. Grant knew breeding bulls could be aggressive, but Torvik was something else, not wild, not impulsive, but terrifyingly intentional. His coat gleamed with sweat despite the winter chill, and his eyes showed a brightness, a razor-sharp intelligence that unsettled even the most experienced professionals. Marcus Rayner, Grant's head cattle manager and a man who had more scars on his arms than most people accumulated memories, stood beside him with a grim expression. Marcus had faced bulls twice Torvik's age and survived stampedes, pen collapses, and freak accidents during his 30 years in the industry. But even he spoke cautiously when discussing this particular animal. Torvik's genetics were flawless, almost legendary. His sire, Iron Crest Titan, was a proven producer valued at $500,000. His dam's lineage went back to champion herds known for perfect structure and impressive stamina. On paper, Torvik should have been one of Halden Prime's most valuable breeding investments. In reality, he had become their most dangerous liability. From the moment he matured, Torvik defied every expectation. He attacked handlers without provocation, destroyed 2 separate containment pens, and displayed an alarming ability to identify and exploit weaknesses in his surroundings. While most aggressive bulls reacted out of fear or territorial instinct, Torvik reacted out of calculation. He waited until handlers stood at inconvenient angles, then struck. He nudged fences gently at first, as if probing for flaws, then returned hours later to test the same spot with precision. That level of strategic behavior was rare in cattle, fascinating in textbooks, but deadly in a commercial operation. Grant had funded consultations with behaviorists, invested in modified enclosures, rotated handlers, and even attempted hormone therapies meant to reduce aggressive tendencies. Nothing helped. Torvik's intelligence worked against every attempt to manage him. Breeding operations needed predictability. They needed bulls who tolerated tight pens, artificial insemination procedures, routine handling, and prolonged confinement without stress. Torvik was the opposite. He despised restriction, fought every attempt to control him, and seemed to deteriorate further with each passing month. Out of options, Grant called in Braden Cole, a man whose reputation for rehabilitating high-risk bulls had made him a legend across 3 states. If anyone could understand Torvik, it would be Braden. Braden arrived, studied the bull in silence for 2 hours, and then exhaled deeply with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. Torvik was magnificent, he admitted, structurally flawless, powerful beyond measure, but fundamentally incompatible with the environment he was expected to work in. The bull was not violent out of malice. He was suffocating inside the very systems designed for commercial breeding. Braden explained that Torvik's intelligence, his awareness, his strategic thinking, made confinement unbearable for him. He was psychologically incapable of living within walls and routines built for animals with simpler needs. Grant listened, shoulders sinking as the truth settled into him. No matter how valuable Torvik's lineage, no matter how much money had been invested, the bull could not stay. He posed too much danger, too much liability, too much unpredictability. After exhausting every other possibility, Grant made the decision he had been avoiding for months. Torvik would be scheduled for livestock disposal, not because he lacked worth, but because modern systems had no place for an animal who could think beyond them. Marcus Rayner sat in his cramped office late in the afternoon, sorting through paperwork for Torvik's scheduled disposal, when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen, Ronenvel, brought a flicker of relief. Ronan had been transporting livestock for 2 decades, known for taking difficult cases and handling them with professionalism that most companies didn't bother with anymore. When Marcus answered, Ronan's familiar deep voice filled the room with an unexpected offer. A large sanctuary in Alaska, Northern Haven Refuge, was willing to take Torvik as a donation instead of sending him to slaughter. They specialized in animals that could not thrive in commercial settings, offering nearly 900 acres of open wilderness for livestock too intelligent or too troubled for typical operations. It stunned Marcus that someplace like that even existed, but the possibility was far better than the grim alternative Torvik faced. Marcus relayed the news to Grant, who immediately agreed. A donation would eliminate liability, avoid the bad optics of destroying a genetically valuable animal, and give Torvik a chance at a life without confinement. The sanctuary's director, according to Ronan, was more than willing, even eager, to take on an animal with Torvik's profile. Thus began a scramble of arrangements. Specialized transport trucks, veterinary clearance forms, shipment manifests, facility codes, emergency contacts, and interstate travel documentation. Torvik would make the long journey by truck to Washington, transfer onto a ferry bound for Alaska, and eventually arrive at Northern Haven's vast landscape. It was complicated, expensive, and time-consuming, but it ensured that the bull's life would be spared. However, amid the rush to complete the paperwork and meet the departure deadline, a simple but catastrophic mistake occurred. Ronan's assistant, working past closing hours under pressure to finalize the documents, mistyped the receiving facility's code. The sanctuary's official code, AK9083742, became AK9083472, a subtle transposition of digits that went unnoticed. On paper, the new code still corresponded to a valid delivery location in Alaska, but not the one Torvik was meant for. Instead of Northern Haven Refuge, the paperwork now directed the bull to a small private property, a remote tourist ranch far north of Anchorage known as Glacier Bend Outpost. Glacier Bend Outpost was owned by Elric Danner, a former bush pilot who had traded aircraft engines for quiet pastures 6 years earlier. Elric ran modest wilderness tours, kept 6 horses and a few cattle for visitors seeking an authentic frontier experience, and lived a life far removed from the chaos of breeding farms. He had no heavy equipment, no reinforced pens, no experience with dangerous livestock, and certainly no expectation of receiving a massive bull from one of the most elite genetics programs in the western United States. Yet the paperwork, stamped, signed, and fully legal, listed his address as the final destination. Ronan's transport team, unaware of the mistake, prepared the bull for the journey. Torvik was loaded into the reinforced trailer after an exhausting struggle that took 4 men, all of whom had dealt with aggressive animals before, but none with Torvik's raw power. The bull, breathing hard, seemed almost aware that his fate was changing, though in ways no one could predict. The truck pulled away from Halden Prime Genetics on a cold November morning, beginning a 3-week journey through Nevada, Oregon, and Washington before heading into Canada and up the long stretch of the Alaska Highway. While the truck carved its path northward, Grant Halden felt a quiet sense of resolution. Torvik was finally going somewhere he could not cause harm, somewhere with space, with freedom, with minimal human interference. Grant believed the sanctuary would have the tools and land necessary to handle such a creature. He believed the problem was finally solved. But as the truck moved farther away, the consequences of 9 digits typed in the wrong order began setting into motion a chain of events no one could have anticipated. By the time Torvik crossed into Alaska, the driver remained oblivious to the error. The digital manifest matched every checkpoint, and no alert was triggered. Everyone involved believed the bull was going exactly where he was meant to be. In truth, he was headed toward a place wholly unprepared, a ranch operated by a man who had not asked for him, did not want him, and had no idea a 3,500-pound force of nature was making its way up a snow-covered gravel road toward his property, all because of a small clerical mistake made in a hurry. The sky over Glacier Bend Outpost was heavy with the gray promise of snow when Elric Danner heard the deep growl of a diesel engine echoing across his frozen pasture. He was out fixing a sagging wire fence post, bundled against the 15-degree chill, when a massive transport truck came crawling up the gravel road like a steel beast out of place in the quiet Alaskan landscape. Confused, Elric wiped his gloves on his jacket and stepped toward the gate as the vehicle halted with a hiss of air brakes. He wasn't expecting deliveries, certainly not a livestock hauler almost the size of his barn. When the driver climbed down, clipboard in hand, and asked for a Glacier Bend outpost, Elric's confusion deepened. He explained that he hadn't ordered any animals, but the driver pointed at the manifest, showing his ranch name, his address, and the required signatures for acceptance. The driver had spent nearly 3 weeks crossing states, enduring breakdown scares, icy roads, and sleepless nights. His patience was gone. He made it clear that he could not haul the animal any farther without violating transport regulations. "Either we unload him here," he said flatly, "or I leave him in the trailer and deal with legal fallout in Anchorage." Elric felt a knot form in his stomach as he asked the question that mattered most. "What exactly am I supposed to be unloading?" When the driver answered, "A 3,500-pound Brunhurst bull, aggressive temperament, high risk," Elric felt the blood drain from his face. His small ranch was built for trail horses and docile cattle, not a massive, unpredictable animal bred from elite genetic stock. Before Elric could argue further, Rowan Cade pulled up in his old pickup truck. Rowan, a weathered man with the strength of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with his hands, looked at the livestock hauler and muttered, "Tell me that's not for us." But it was. The paperwork left no room for negotiation, and the driver was already walking toward the trailer latch. With no time to seek clarification, Elric and Rowan hurried to improvise a crude chute using the pickups and fence panels to at least direct the bull toward the large north pasture, one of the few open spaces on the property. When the trailer door swung open, Torvik blasted out with the force of a runaway freight train. Snow sprayed beneath his hooves as he charged forward, skidding slightly on the frozen ground before pivoting with astonishing precision. His bellow echoed across the fields, a raw, thunderous sound that made Elric's heart thump painfully in his chest. Rowan cursed under his breath. This was no normal bull. Torvik stood taller than any cattle Elric had ever seen, muscles rippling beneath his white coat, steam rising from his body in the frigid air. But then something unexpected happened. The bull didn't charge. He didn't attack. Instead, he slowed, first to a trot, then to a deliberate walk, as he surveyed the land stretching out before him. His gaze drifted across the distant mountains, the tree line, the sky, the open expanse that made up Glacier Bend's north pasture. His breathing steadied, his posture lowered. He looked, not like a trapped, enraged creature, but like something awakening after years of confinement. The tension Elric expected never came. Instead, Torvik stepped deeper into the pasture and began to explore silently, his movements steady and surprisingly peaceful. Once the driver had dumped the paperwork and departed, leaving a cloud of powdered snow in his wake, Elric raced inside to call the transport company. No answer. Holiday voicemail. He tried Halden Prime Genetics. Closed for Thanksgiving weekend. It was Wednesday. Offices wouldn't reopen for 5 more days. That meant Torvik, whether Elric liked it or not, was his responsibility. Rowan shook his head, muttering that a fence made for docile cattle wouldn't hold a bull like that if he decided to leave, but Torvik showed no interest in escape. He walked the perimeter calmly, not testing it aggressively, but mapping it with eerie intelligence. Over the next 24 hours, Elric and Rowan kept their distance while observing him. What they saw continued to defy every warning written in the shipping notes. Torvik grazed peacefully. He drank from the trough without agitation. He explored his environment with curiosity instead of hostility. He even stood for long periods staring toward the mountains, as if something in the open wilderness soothed a part of him that had been screaming in the confined pens of Nevada. Rowan, baffled, muttered that the bull looked more like an animal finally breathing freely than one plotting destruction. The next morning, Elric's son, Jaren, returned home for the University of Alaska for a Thanksgiving break. When he saw Torvik, he practically sprinted to the fence. Jaron studied ecology and animal behavior, and the moment he observed Torvik's movements, the way he used space, the lack of compulsive pacing, the relaxed tail sways, he knew something remarkable was happening. He told his father that Torvik wasn't acting like a dangerous animal at all, but like one decompressing after severe confinement stress. The bull wasn't aggressive. He was recovering. He wasn't unpredictable. He was finally in a place that matched his psychology. It was a stunning realization, one that would change everything that followed. By Monday morning, after what felt like an eternity of unanswered calls and mounting uncertainty, Elric finally reached Ronanville. The transporter's voice came through the line fraught with apology and disbelief. Ronan explained that a mistake had been discovered, a simple transposition of 2 digits in the receiving facility's address code. Torvik had been intended for Northern Haven Refuge, not Glacier Bend Outpost. Elric gripped the phone tighter, stunned that something so trivial had caused such a monumental error. But the mistake alone wasn't the worst part. Ronan went on to explain that Northern Haven had just undergone a mandatory quarantine due to a respiratory illness spreading among its herd. No new animals were allowed into the facility for at least 6 weeks. Torvik could not go there. He also could not legally be abandoned, nor could he be returned to Halden Prime Genetics due to liability issues. "Mr. Danner," Ronan said with a weary voice, "you're the only place he can stay for now." Elric looked out the window toward the snow-bright pasture where Torvik grazed calmly beneath the winter sun. He felt a strange pull, fear mixed with responsibility, and something deeper he couldn't name. Despite the shipping notes that described Torvik as dangerously aggressive, the bull had shown nothing but quiet curiosity since arriving. Elric told Ronan he would keep Torvik temporarily, on the condition that all costs were covered and liability waivers were signed. Ronan agreed immediately, relief saturating his tone. With the terms set, Torvik's unintended stay at Glacier Bend became official. Over the following days, something extraordinary unfolded across the outpost. Torvik began to establish clear routines, almost like a creature rediscovering a natural rhythm long denied to him. Early each morning, he would walk the entire fence perimeter, not in frantic escape attempts, but in deliberate, thoughtful pacing, as though surveying a territory he was finally free to claim. Afterward, he would graze near the ridge where the pasture sloped into sweeping views of the distant mountains. In the afternoons, he settled beneath a small grove of spruce trees, sheltering himself from the wind with a calmness that neither Elric nor Rowan had ever witnessed in a bull, especially one with Torvik's reputation. There were no charges, no slammed gates, no snorts of rising aggression. Only steady breath, relaxed muscles, and an animal learning how to exist without the constant pressure of confinement. When Dr. Rylan Holt arrived, a seasoned, large animal veterinarian respected across Alaska, he took his time before approaching Torvik. Rylan had read about the bull. Halden Prime Genetics had published a case report detailing their unsuccessful attempts to manage him, highlighting his unpredictable aggression, violent behavior, and behavioral anomalies. Many in the field regarded Torvik as a lost cause. But as Rylan observed him from the pasture's edge, his professional skepticism cracked. The bull didn't pin his ears back or paw the ground. Instead, he studied Rylan calmly, ears rotated forward, body relaxed, breathing steady. When a veterinarian entered the pasture with slow, deliberate steps, Torvik shifted his weight but didn't charge. He watched. He waited. He accepted Rylan's presence. Rylan was astonished. He moved closer, stopping several yards away, and conducted a visual exam. Torvik showed no signs of distress, no frantic tail flicks, no tension in his shoulders, no erratic movements. His respiratory rate was normal. His gaze was alert, not panicked. Rylan stepped back to Elric and Rowan and said something that would alter the course of the entire situation. "This bull isn't aggressive. He's decompressing." According to Rylan, Torvik's behavior was consistent with animals experiencing relief after extreme confinement stress. He explained that high-intelligence livestock can break psychologically when subjected to cramped environments and constant handling. "You didn't receive a dangerous animal," he said. You receive an animal who is overwhelmed by the wrong environment. Jaren arrived with his phone, eager to contribute evidence from his own observations. He had been filming Torvik since the bull's first morning at Glacier Bend. He showed Ryland footage of Torvik tracing the pasture boundaries with meticulous attention, moving through distinct zones with purpose. He's mapping, Jaren said. He's not pacing like stressed cattle do. He's learning. Another clip showed Torvik standing silently while a moose cow and her calf wandered along the far fence line. Instead of charging or reacting defensively, Torvik simply watched them, curious but calm. Ryland nodded in awe. He had never seen a bull with this combination of intelligence, spatial awareness, and emotional adaptability. After reviewing the evidence, Ryland made a conclusion that felt both shocking and obvious in hindsight. Torvik was never inherently dangerous. His aggression was the result of systemic mismatch, an intelligent, highly aware animal forced into spaces too small for his mind and too rigid for his instincts. In an open pasture with minimal human intrusion, he was not only manageable but thriving. What had been labeled a fatal flaw was, in truth, a symptom of human misunderstanding. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Elric stood at the fence watching the bull who had arrived by mistake. He finally whispered the truth both he and Ryland had now seen clearly. You weren't broken. You were just caged. Grant cleared his throat, steadying himself, because what he was about to propose was not business. It was responsibility. He told Elric that if he chose to keep Torvik permanently, Halden Prime Genetics would fund every necessary improvement to the ranch. Stronger perimeter fencing, new winter shelters, upgraded feed lines, veterinary coverage, and the hiring of an additional hand if needed. He also offered monthly compensation, enough to ensure Torvik's care never became a financial burden. But most surprising of all, Grant offered to sponsor an academic study with the University of Alaska to document Torvik's behavioral transformation. He wanted the industry to understand the truth he had ignored for too long, that animals labeled as dangerous often suffer from environments that suffocate their instincts and overwhelm their minds. Grant wasn't trying to buy redemption. He was trying to correct the system that had failed Torvik in the first place. Elric listened quietly, arms crossed against the biting wind, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The offer was generous, more generous than anything he had ever been given. But it also meant accepting responsibility for an animal that had once terrified an entire breeding facility. He thought about the work, the long winters, the cost, the commitment. He thought about Torvik, standing alone beneath the spruce trees, as still as a monument carved from snow and muscle. Rowan joined them, boots crunching through the icy ground, and silently assessed the bull from a distance. He's no trouble, Rowan finally said, almost reluctantly. Not like what they described. He just needed space. It was the simplest explanation, yet it struck Elric hardest. Space. Something Glacier Bend had in abundance, but Halden Prime's breeding pens never offered. Jaren approached next, laptop still under his arm, cheeks red from the cold. His voice carried a conviction Elric had rarely seen in his son. Dad, he said softly, this isn't just a bull. This is a case study that could change how people think about animal behavior. Jaren explained that Torvik's documentation had already impressed his professors. His transformation was the kind of phenomenon that could influence industry standards, wildlife policy, and future research on livestock psychology. He insisted that Torvik was not a burden, but an opportunity for meaningful impact. Elric stared at his son, realizing how rarely he had seen such passion and certainty in him. Grant waited quietly for Elric's decision, the weight of his own regret hanging heavy in the frozen air. Finally, Elric exhaled, long and slow, watching the steam drift upward like a reluctant surrender. He turned his gaze toward the bull who had arrived by accident, an accident that had revealed truths no one wanted to confront. Torvik lifted his head, his breath rising in clouds, his posture relaxed yet powerful. He was no longer the myth of violence described in the shipping notes. He was an animal finally allowed to exist as himself. He wasn't meant for walls, Elric murmured. He was meant for this. Grant swallowed, holding his breath as he waited for the verdict. Elric nodded once. "He stays," he said simply. Those two words felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of something entirely new. Relief washed over Grant's features, but so did humility. He thanked Elric, not as a businessman thanking a rancher, but as a man acknowledging a debt to the creature he had misunderstood. Torvik had survived because of a shipping error, but he would thrive because Elric chose to give him a home. And in that decision, Grant saw the beginning of a change he had never anticipated, a shift that would echo far beyond Glacier Bend Outpost. 6 months passed like the slow turn of northern seasons, and Torvik transformed before everyone's eyes. The once tense, unpredictable bull now roamed across a 70-acre pasture that Halden Prime Genetics had funded and Glacier Bend Outpost had reshaped for his new life. The expanded fencing glinted against the pale sun, reinforced, tall, and sturdy. Not because Torvik needed containment, but because he deserved security. Nearby, a newly constructed winter shelter stood warmly against the wind, its design carefully adapted to allow the bull maximum visibility and movement. The bull who once shook steel gates with his fury now walked with a steady, almost serene presence, his white coat reflecting the bright Alaska sky like snow come alive. Researchers from the University of Alaska arrived with tripods, monitors, and behavioral charts, their interest piqued by Torvik's extraordinary psychological reversal. They documented everything: movement patterns, feeding rhythms, environmental interactions, hormonal fluctuations. What they recorded upended long-held assumptions about breeding bulls and intelligence in livestock. Torvik's cortisol levels, which had been dangerously high in Nevada, had fallen by more than 65%. His weight had increased, not from stress eating or sedentary confinement, but from healthy grazing and natural activity across wide-open terrain. Most astonishingly, he had integrated with Elric's small herd of 3 docile cattle. In Nevada, Torvik could not be placed near another animal without showing aggression. Here, he grazed side by side with them as though he had always belonged. Jaron, now serving as the research project's lead undergraduate collaborator, reviewed hours of captured footage. His laptop held months of data showing how Torvik navigated the environment with remarkable intelligence, choosing specific resting spots depending on wind direction, mapping natural water flow across the property, and recognizing patterns in the wildlife that passed through the outskirts of the pasture. Jaron often stood at the fence in awe, marveling at the bull who had taught him more about animal behavior than any ecology textbook ever had. He spoke passionately during every meeting with the research faculty, arguing that Torvik's case proved a critical oversight in commercial livestock management. High-intelligence animals were being confined in systems built for uniform, predictable behavior. Grant Halden upheld his promise fully and without hesitation. He funded the new fencing, paid for the shelter construction, covered veterinary costs, and even contributed to Rowan's full-time employment to ensure the ranch had the manpower needed for Torvik's long-term care. But Grant didn't stop there. He used Torvik's story as the catalyst for sweeping reforms at Halden Prime Genetics. The company began redesigning its facilities to provide more space for bulls exhibiting advanced cognitive traits. Pens were expanded. Handling procedures were modified. Environmental enrichment elements, items once dismissed as unnecessary, became standard practice. Grant announced these changes publicly, acknowledging Torvik as the reason behind them. For a man known for his pride and precision, admitting fault on an industry stage was no small feat. Other breeding operations took notice. Calls began pouring into Glacier Bend Outpost. Ranchers from Montana, Oklahoma, and British Columbia reached out, asking to consult with Elric and Jaron about bulls once labeled dangerous or unmanageable. They wanted to know whether open space rehabilitation might save animals previously destined for slaughter. And in several cases, after reviewing Torvik's documented transformation, they sent their bulls to trial sanctuaries modeled after Glacier Bend's environment. The national breeding community had never seen a case like Torvik's, and it reshaped conversations at conferences, veterinary seminars, and agricultural policy meetings. Journalists visited Glacier Bend, to capture Torvik's story. A reporter from Alaska Wildlife magazine called him the bull who rewrote the textbook, and an agricultural journal published a feature titled From Liability to Legacy: How One Bull Changed Breeding Science. Veterinarian Dr. Ryland Holt became a sought-after expert, invited to speak about Torvik's recovery at veterinary symposiums. He often began his talks with a single, powerful sentence: aggression is not always a flaw in the animal. It is often a flaw in the environment. Torvik, unaware of the movement he had ignited, continued his quiet routines. He stood each evening on the ridge overlooking the mountains, steam rising from his nostrils as the wind rustled his coat. He no longer looked like a creature fighting to escape. He looked like a creature who had finally arrived where he belonged. His presence had become a symbol of resilience, of the way nature pushes back when confined and flourishes when understood. Winter in Glacier Bend had a way of swallowing sound. Snow fell in slow, deliberate layers, blanketing the land in a quiet that felt ancient, almost sacred. In that silence, Elric Danner often found himself standing at the northern fence line in the fading light of evening, watching the massive silhouette of Torvik as he stood facing the mountains. The bull had chosen a favorite spot, near the ridge overlooking the distant peaks, where the wind carried scents from the forest and the sky seemed wider than anywhere else on the ranch. His breath rose in warm clouds, dissipating into the twilight as though he were exhaling the last remnants of the life he once endured. Elric marveled at the transformation. The bull who had arrived thrashing with frustration, powerful enough to tear steel, now stood like a creature carved from calmness itself, a reminder that strength had many shapes, and not all of them required force. Rowan Cade sometimes joined Elric at the fence, leaning his elbows against the cold metal as they watched Torvik's steady posture. Rowan had been skeptical at first, skeptical of the bull, of the responsibility, of the risk. But over time, the skepticism had faded into something like admiration. The ranch hand would shake his head and chuckle softly, saying, "Funny thing, boss. That shipping mistake might have been the best thing that ever happened to him." Elric never argued. He knew Rowan was right. What began as an error in paperwork, a single pair of digits swapped by someone rushing to meet a deadline, had altered not only Torvik's fate, but their own lives as well. Torvik no longer seemed like a misplaced animal. He seemed like a creature fulfilling a destiny no breeding facility could have provided. He walked the land with purpose, learned its contours, recognized its storms before they came. He interacted with Elric's smaller cattle herd with ease, nudging them away from icy patches or standing between them and a prowling shadow at the tree-line. He never showed the aggression described in the pages of the Nevada case study. Instead, he showed intelligence, sensitivity, and a quiet kind of leadership that no one had expected from a bull once labeled too dangerous to keep alive. Journalists continued to visit Glacier Bend to document Torvik's story. Some came to understand the science, others to witness the unlikely miracle of a bull who went from a threat to a triumph. Ryland Holt explained to every reporter that Torvik's aggression had never been a flaw, it was a language. He had been communicating his distress in the only way confinement allowed him to. Once given space, autonomy, and an environment that matched his mind, he did not just improve, he transformed. Articles circulated nationwide, sparking discussions at livestock conferences, veterinary schools, and agricultural boards. Torvik had become a living argument for reform. Grant Halden also returned periodically, not as a breeder evaluating an asset, but as a man paying respect to a life he had once misunderstood. He walked the pasture with Elric, sometimes quietly, sometimes apologetically, always with humility. Grant admitted more than once that Torvik had taught him a lesson he should have learned long ago, that systems built for profit often fail the animals they depended on. The reforms he initiated at Halden Prime Genetics spread to other operations. Some ranches built larger paddocks. Others implemented behavioral assessments for bulls with above-average intelligence. A handful redesigned their entire approach to handling livestock, all because Torvik had shown the industry what it had ignored for decades. For Elric, However, Torvik's impact was more personal. Caring for the bull was not simply a responsibility. It had become a calling. He saw in Torvik a reminder of the world's fragile balance. The truth that even the strongest creatures could break under the wrong conditions, and the even greater truth that they could flourish when given what they needed, not what humans expected of them. There was something profoundly humbling about watching an animal reclaim himself day by day. It made Elric rethink not just how he ranches, but how he lives. One night, as a storm gathered over the mountains, Elric stepped out into the cold and approached the fence. Torvik stood in his usual spot, head lifted toward the horizon, as though sensing the shift in the air before the first flakes fell. His breath drifted upward in slow curls, merging with the sky. When Elric whispered, "You're home now," the bull turned, just slightly, acknowledging the presence of the man who had chosen to understand him. Torvik did not move closer or farther. He simply stood there, calm, whole, unbroken. It was a quiet moment, but in that quiet lived an undeniable truth. Torvik had not just found a place to survive. He had found a place to be himself. The ranch that never expected him became the sanctuary he always needed. And because of him, ranchers across the country were beginning to rethink how animals should be treated. Not as commodities defined by productivity or confinement, but as living beings whose environments mattered just as much as their genetics. In Glacier Bend Outpost, far from the cage that once restrained him, Torvik stood beneath the sweeping Alaska sky, surrounded by open land, mountains, and the silence of a world that finally gave him room to breathe. He was no longer the bull everyone rejected. He was the bull who changed everything. And in the stillness of that winter evening, he was exactly what he was always meant to be: home.